Imagine stepping on stage to sing for 2,000 people, knowing that somewhere in the audience there might be someone who didn't come for the music. In 197, Elvis Presley received a message that never appeared in any book. 24 hours. Either he paid a Las Vegas debt, or that would be his last night alive. In the hallways of the International Hotel, nobody spoke loudly. In the dressing room, Elvis cried. And on stage, he did something that to this day nobody has been able to properly explain. This isn't a story about glamour, it's about fear, and about a detail in that performance that looked like art, but might have been a cry for help. Las Vegas in the early 70s was Elvis Presley's kingdom. The International Hotel, later renamed the Hilton, had become his second home. A glittering palace where he commanded stages and crowds with the same authority he'd once wielded over teenage audiences 2 decades earlier. The numbers were staggering. Sold-out shows night after night, contracts worth millions, standing ovations that lasted so long they cut into scheduled showtimes. From the outside, it looked like pure success, the kind of triumph that confirmed Elvis as the undisputed king. But behind the sequined jumpsuits and thunderous applause, there were whispers, rumors that floated through the casino floors and backstage corridors like smoke, impossible to grasp, but impossible to ignore. Stories about markers signed late at night when the adrenaline was high and judgment was compromised. About private games in rooms where cameras didn't reach. About debts that weren't recorded in official ledgers but were remembered with perfect clarity by people whose memories were more dangerous than any contract. The man who delivered the message wasn't someone whose face would appear in FBI surveillance photos. He wasn't a capo or a made man. He was an intermediary, the kind of person who exists specifically to create distance between threats and those who issue them. He appeared backstage on a Tuesday afternoon while Elvis was going through sound check for that evening's performance. He didn't approach Elvis directly. Instead, he spoke to someone in Elvis's inner circle, someone close enough to the star to deliver messages, but expendable enough not to matter if things went wrong. The message itself was delivered in language that was almost casual in its simplicity. 24 hours. No dramatic speeches, no specific threats. Just a time frame that everyone understood meant something far more serious than it sounded. When asked about what exactly needed to happen in those 24 hours, the intermediary was equally vague. Asserts pendentes, he said, outstanding settlements, things that needed to be made right, balances that needed to be corrected. Elvis wasn't stupid. He'd grown up poor, navigated the music industry's sharks, survived Hollywood's manipulations. He understood that this wasn't really about money. Not entirely. Money was never just money in Las Vegas. It was control. It was power. It was about demonstrating who really owned these glittering temples of chance. The name Chicago started appearing in fragments of conversation, never in complete sentences, just Chicago, said with weight that needed no elaboration. Everyone who needed to understand understood. His staff noticed immediately. Elvis, who normally joked between songs during sound check, went silent. His legendary appetite disappeared. The catered meals sent to his suite returned untouched. The easy charisma that he could turn on like a light switch remained off, even when people tried to engage him. Late that afternoon, Elvis asked his manager something that sent chills through everyone who heard it. "If I don't go on stage tonight, what happens?" The question hung in the air. The manager opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. What could he say? Cancel the show and face the wrath of the hotel? Disappoint thousands of fans? Or acknowledge the real question underneath? What happens if Elvis simply disappears? The answer came not in words, but in silence. And in that silence, everyone understood. The clock was ticking. 24 hours. The presidential suite of the International Hotel transformed into an improvised fortress within hours of the message being delivered. What had been Elvis's luxurious sanctuary all plush carpets and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Vegas Strip, now felt more like a prison cell decorated in gold leaf and velvet. Security doubled overnight. Men appeared in the hallways who hadn't been there that morning. Some wore the hotel's standard security uniforms. Others wore suits that were too expensive for hotel employees. They stood at strategic points, by the elevators near the service entrances, at the door to Elvis's suite itself. But the increased security brought no comfort. In fact, it created new tension, because nobody really knew who these men worked for. The hotel, Elvis's management, or someone else entirely. Trust evaporated. Everyone watched everyone else with suspicion, barely concealed behind professional courtesy. Phone calls were made throughout the late afternoon and early evening. Elvis's people working connections, calling in favors, reaching out to anyone who might have influence in the invisible world where these matters were decided. Some calls were answered, many weren't. The ones that were answered often ended quickly, with vague promises and careful language that committed to nothing. On contact, someone with federal connections, though his exact role was never clearly defined, mentioned the FBI. But in the same breath, he made clear that official intervention would take time, would require evidence, would involve procedures that didn't align with a 24-hour deadline. It was a suggestion without substance, a possibility without promise. Around 7 p.m., 3 hours before showtime, Elvis asked everyone to leave. Not aggressively, not with anger, just quietly, firmly. "I need to be alone for a while." His inner circle hesitated. Being alone seemed dangerous given the circumstances, but something in Elvis's voice made it clear this wasn't negotiable. They filed out, leaving him in the massive suite with just his thoughts and his fear. What happened in that hour of solitude is known only from what Elvis later shared in fragments with people he trusted. He cried. For the first time in years, maybe since his mother died, and he broke down completely, sat on the edge of that expensive bed and wept like a child. He spoke aloud to Gladys, his mother, gone for more than a decade, but still the person he turned to in his darkest moments. He talked about destiny, about whether this was always how it was meant to end, about mistakes that couldn't be undone, choices that couldn't be unmade. At some point during that hour, someone who was in the suite afterward noticed something odd. A heavy metallic object, possibly a gun, though nobody would confirm, had appeared on the coffee table. When Elvis's people were allowed back in, the object was gone. Where it came from, where it went, what Elvis had been thinking when it was there, those questions were never answered. The costume designer arrived at 8 p.m. with the jumpsuit Elvis was scheduled to wear. Elvis looked at it, shook his head and asked for changes. Different stones, different cut. The designer was confused. There was barely time to make alterations, but did as asked. Nobody understood why it mattered, but everything mattered now. Someone, probably the manager, suggested the unthinkable. "We could cancel. Say you're sick. We'll deal with the hotel, the fans, everything. But you'd be safe." Elvis's response was immediate and absolute. "No." "Elvis, if you go out there..." "If I don't go out there, I'm finished anyway," Elvis interrupted. "At least on stage there are witnesses, thousands of them." Then he said something that nobody who heard it ever forgot. He was looking out the window at the Vegas lights when he spoke, his voice quiet but certain. "If I go on stage, maybe I live." The implication was clear. Staying hidden offered no safety. Only the performance, public, visible, recorded, might provide protection. At 9:30 p.m., Elvis left the suite. The show was about to begin. The visitor arrived at 9 p.m., exactly 90 minutes before showtime. He didn't check in at the front desk, didn't announce himself to hotel security, didn't take the main elevators that carried guests and fans and curious onlookers up to the higher floors. He simply appeared in the hallway outside Elvis's suite, as if he'd materialized from the expensive wallpaper itself. One moment, the corridor was empty except for the usual security detail. The next, he was there, middle-aged, well-dressed in a way that suggested money without flash, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. The security guards stiffened when they saw him, but they didn't stop him. That detail alone told anyone watching that this man had clearance from someone very high up the chain of authority. He knocked once on the suite door. It opened immediately, as if Elvis had been waiting right on the other side. What happened in the next 37 minutes has no official record. The security cameras in that hallway suffered a convenient malfunction during that exact window of time. The guards who stood outside the door were rotated out shortly after and assigned to different properties. The hotel's logbook showed no visitor registered to Elvis's floor during that hour. According to the few fragments that emerged later through people who had no reason to lie and nothing to gain from speaking, only 2 people were in that room, Elvis and the visitor. No lawyers, no witnesses, no recording devices. When they emerged, they exited separately. The visitor left first, taking the service elevator down to the parking garage. Elvis came out 7 minutes later, his expression unreadable. Neither man acknowledged the other's existence. To anyone watching, they were strangers who had never met. The word that circulated afterward, whispered in corners, never stated directly, was adiamento. Postponement. Not forgiveness. Not cancellation. Not resolution. Just a temporary suspension of whatever consequences had been hanging over Elvis's head. No papers were signed, no handshake sealed any deal, no witnesses could testify to what terms might have been discussed or agreed upon. It existed in that grey space where the most serious business is often conducted, beyond the reach of law, beyond the scope of documentation, beyond anything that could be proven or disproven. One detail seemed significant. The visitor didn't go to the casino that night, didn't gamble, didn't eat in any of the restaurants, didn't appear anywhere public in the hotel. He simply vanished as mysteriously as he'd arrived, leaving behind only questions and the unsettling certainty that something had changed. Minutes after the visitor left, Elvis called his band director with an urgent request. Change the set list. Songs that had been rehearsed were removed, others were added. The director protested. There was no time to prepare. The musicians hadn't practiced certain arrangements. Elvis was insistent. One song in particular had to be included, a number they hadn't performed in weeks, something that required specific staging and lighting cues that the crew would have to improvise. Just trust me, Elvis said. It has to be tonight. The atmosphere backstage shifted from fear to something more complex. Not relief. Nobody felt relieved. But perhaps a temporary reprieve had been granted. The immediate danger had been postponed, pushed back, given breathing room. Yet the feeling among Elvis's inner circle was unanimous. This wasn't over. Whatever had been discussed in that room, whatever arrangement had been made, it felt less like a solution and more like a suspension of sentence. The execution had been delayed, but the sword still hung over Elvis's head. And now he had to walk on stage and perform as if none of this was happening, as if his life hadn't been threatened, as if the next few hours wouldn't determine whether he'd see morning. The show was about to begin. The lights came up at exactly 10 p.m. 2,000 people erupted in applause as the orchestra began the opening bars of the theme that announced Elvis's entrance. The sound was deafening. Anticipation, excitement, the collective energy of fans who had paid good money and waited hours for this moment. Elvis walked onto the stage of the International Hotel showroom to a standing ovation that shook the chandeliers. He wore the modified jumpsuit, white with elaborate silver and turquoise stones that caught the stage lights and scattered reflections across the first few rows of the audience. To the crowd, he looked exactly as he should. The king, confident and commanding, ready to deliver the performance they'd come to see. But those who knew him, really knew him, saw something different immediately. His guitarist, who had played behind Elvis for 5 years, noticed it in the walk. Elvis usually bounded onto stage with energy that seemed to come from nowhere, as if the applause itself recharged him. Tonight, his steps were measured, controlled, almost mechanical. He was moving through practiced motions rather than feeling them. The microphone stand was center stage, as always. Elvis gripped it with both hands as he acknowledged the crowd's welcome. His knuckles went white from the pressure. He was holding on as if the microphone stand was the only thing keeping him upright. The first song went well enough. His voice was strong, hitting the notes with the power that had made him famous. But during the second number, a slower ballad that usually showcased his emotional range, something shifted. His eyes, which normally scanned the audience with connection and warmth, fixed on a single point, row 12, left side, near the aisle. He stared at that spot with intensity that had nothing to do with performance. The audience assumed he was connecting with a fan. His band knew better. Someone was sitting there. Someone Elvis needed to see, or someone who needed to see Elvis. The third song was one that hadn't been in the original set list, the one he'd insisted on adding hours earlier. It was a gospel number, something about faith and deliverance and being saved from darkness. His voice cracked midway through, not technically, not from strain, but emotionally. The kind of break that comes when the words you're singing hit too close to something real. He improvised a line that wasn't in the original lyrics. Instead of "save me from my sins," he sang "save me from this moment." The audience didn't notice. The musicians did. The lyric change was too specific, too odd, too personal to be accidental. During an instrumental break, Elvis made a gesture with his right hand that didn't match any choreography the band had seen him do before. He touched his chest, then extended his hand palm up toward that same spot in row 12, then brought the hand back to his heart. It looked theatrical, artistic, part of the show. But it wasn't. It was communication, a message being sent to someone in that audience who would understand its meaning. The ballad that followed should have been easy for Elvis. He'd performed it hundreds of times. But tonight, during the final verse, his voice failed completely for 3 seconds. He simply stood there, mouth open, no sound emerging. The orchestra continued playing. The backup singers filled the gap. Elvis recovered and finished the song. The audience erupted in applause, assuming it was dramatic pause, artistic choice, emotional intensity. His band knew it was fear. For just those 3 seconds, terror had overcome training. The performance had cracked, revealing the frightened man underneath. After the next song, Elvis did something unprecedented. He turned his back to the audience and walked upstage, away from the lights into relative shadow. He stood there for perhaps 10 seconds, his shoulders rising and falling with deep breaths. The crowd thought it was showmanship. It was panic management. When he turned back, his smile was in place, but anyone looking closely could see his hands shaking as he reached for the microphone. The show continued, art and fear indistinguishable. The show ended at 11:47 p.m. Elvis took his final bow to thunderous applause, waved to the crowd with both hands raised in his signature gesture, and smiled that famous smile that had charmed millions for nearly 2 decades. To everyone in that audience, it had been another spectacular Elvis performance. Powerful vocals, emotional delivery, the perfect blend of energy and intimacy that made people feel like he was singing directly to them. They left the showroom buzzing with satisfaction, already telling friends about the incredible night they'd just experienced. But something was different in how it ended. Elvis didn't come back for the encore. Normally, he'd leave the stage, let the applause build to a crescendo, then return for 1 or 2 more songs that sent the audience home on an even higher note. It was part of the formula, the expected rhythm of his Vegas shows. That night, when he walked off stage, he kept walking, down the backstage corridor, past his dressing room, straight toward the service exit that employees used. His security detail surrounded him in formation they'd never used before. Tight, professional, leaving no gaps. He didn't stop to greet fans waiting backstage. Didn't pause to thank the band. Didn't do any of the post-show rituals that were normally as much a part of the performance as the show itself. He was in a car and leaving the hotel property within 4 minutes of the final curtain. The speed was unprecedented. The next morning, the Las Vegas entertainment columnists wrote their reviews. "Elvis triumphs again," read one headline. "The King reigns supreme at the International," declared another. The reviews mentioned powerful vocals, enthusiastic audience response, another successful night in Elvis's legendary Vegas residency. Not one word about tension. Not one mention of anything unusual. No hints of danger or threat or fear, just standard glowing coverage of a standard spectacular show. The incident, if there had been an incident, left no trace in the official record. The supposed ultimatum was never confirmed by anyone who would speak on the record. No police reports, no FBI investigations, no casino security memos that ever surfaced. Elvis continued his Vegas shows. The world moved on. The night became just another performance in a career filled with thousands of them. But decades later, something strange started happening. Fans who collected bootleg recordings of Elvis's Vegas shows began comparing different performances. They noticed something odd about that particular night. A gesture during one song that didn't appear in any other recording. A lyric change that seemed too specific to be random. That moment when his voice failed and his back was to the audience. The recording captured something in his posture that suggested genuine distress rather than theatrical pause. Online forums dedicated to Elvis began discussing it. Frame-by-frame analysis of the few photographs that existed from that night. Speculation about what the hand gesture might have meant. Debates about whether the modified set list had significance. Experts disagreed sharply. Music historians dismissed it as fans reading too much into normal performance variations. Elvis improvised constantly, they argued. Finding meaning in every gesture is like reading tea leaves. But others, particularly those who studied body language, who understood the psychology of fear, who knew how people behaved under extreme pressure, weren't so sure. "Watch his eyes," one analyst pointed out. "He's not performing, he's communicating." The mob connection was never proven. The debt was never documented. The visitor who supposedly came to Elvis's suite that night was never identified. Everything remained in the realm of rumor, speculation, whispered stories that couldn't be verified. Yet the question persisted, growing stronger rather than fading with time. What if that night wasn't a show? What if it was a negotiation conducted in front of 2,000 witnesses who didn't know they were watching? What if every song, every gesture, every improvised lyric was Elvis sending messages to someone in that audience, proving he was complying, demonstrating he understood the terms, showing he would cooperate? What if the performance that looked like art was actually survival? We'll never know for certain, but sometimes, late at night, when you watch footage from that show, you can see it, fear, disguised as entertainment.